Ярослав є директором школи управління Українського католицького університету. Ми в межах факультету суспільних наук долучилися до організації цієї події. Сподіваюся, що сьогодні буде досить корисною, цікавою. Я заохочую вас брати участь у дискусії. Let me speak to English. Dear Professor, thank you that you come to us, and I would like to introduce our moderator for our today's discussion, Roman Nazarenko.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with Professor Casanova and Professor Okay, so I guess that I will propose the structure. I will ask these several questions to our professors, and then I hope that it will be several questions from the auditory, so that I want you to be involved in our discussion. So, dear professors, the first question for you. Democracy and liberalism, so they gives the opportunity or even the right for all groups, for everyone. It is connected to the great discussion about the religion. Whether religion is, let's say, stays in the private sphere, in the private dimension, or whether we can say that religion is connected to the public sphere, public dimension. And this also opens another question, whether religion could be present in public sphere at least. So that's, here is also my question, and whether can a secular state allow space or enough space for religion? What's your ideas about this?
Well, Jose wrote the book on that question.
Good answer.
I am a diplomat by training, so you don't stand on landmines.
And he's my boss.
Because you wrote a book.
So that's a very good argument for Jose to go first. Well, a great risk. I'll take in the American experience, certainly, we have a government that is disestablished. There's no church, there's no state church. Now there have been, in different historical periods, there have been dominant churches and dominant religious groups, but never one officially sanctioned by the federal government. And as a result of that, we have a robust, wild, decentralized, feral public square where religion, there's no set script for how religion interacts in the public. And that spurs oftentimes reactions. There are secular folk who say, no religion in the public sphere is purely a private decision. You drive a certain brand of car, I drive a certain brand of car, you're a Catholic, I'm a Methodist. But that's really a fairy tale, I think, in the American experience. And now, in terms of what does religious freedom mean in this pluralistic environment, that's still very much a contested subject. Most Americans will say, I believe in religious freedom. Well, what does that mean pragmatically and practically? It's very contested, and we have liberal views, we have conservative views, we have centrist views of that. And that's what makes America so interesting, but also so frustrating, that whatever modus vivendi is negotiated today may evaporate a year from now. Currently in our presidential politics, we have an administration now that views public religion very differently than the Obama administration did when I worked in our diplomatic apparatus. So I would say at its best, America's an experiment trying to find out what is the answer to that question. We will never come, I think, to a constitutional settlement of that question. So that's what makes America, I think, both intriguing and interesting, but simultaneously frustrating. Let me just say one more thing, and then I'll shut up. I mean, historically, America has been dominated by various Protestant denominations. I think we're clearly in a period now where the hegemony of American Protestantism is in radical decline. That's a sociological fact. I think the other sociological dynamic, which is very interesting, is the fastest growing group of religious affiliation is the none of the above. People, particularly my children's generation, who are not officially, now that's not to say they aren't religious in some form, so even the definition of what constitutes religion is more up for grabs now in the American context probably than any time, certainly in my lifetime. So that's kind of a quick and dirty tour through what is a very complicated scenario. I think internationally, I'm giving a lecture in Kiev where I'm trying to look at 3 case studies of bad American outcomes in terms of religious freedom in a pluralistic environment. Perhaps the most educated we do of other countries is sometimes don't be like us. As Americans many times say, be like us. Well, this is a case where maybe the best wisdom we have to offer is learn from our mistakes. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So,
yeah, I think it's very important. Your question about liberalism and democracy, very important to distinguish precisely 2 types of liberalism and democracy. The European was based on the assumption of a process of secularization, where religion, as I argued, is not only declines, but also becomes private and basically irrelevant. Also because of the myth of the religious wars in the formation of the European political consciousness. That precisely religion is very dangerous in the political sphere. That's why the state needs to privatize religion and to control it. So this is part of the stories that Europeans have told about themselves. Certainly it was the way in which the Enlightenment constructed the theory of religion, which is very different from the United States. As Tocqueville saw when he came to the United States, he said religion, despite having no affairs of government, is the most political, or is the most important of their political institutions. So it's not part of the government, and yet is a very public religion. It's part of the public sphere, and it was always for good and for bad, precisely. Because exactly it doesn't mean, today the liberal argument is against the secularists, who argue that there's something special about religion, therefore has to be kept, the religious arguments have to be kept out of the public sphere, because they are non-rational arguments, therefore non-negotiable, and only secular arguments should be allowed in the public sphere. This argument that was repeated until not very recently, even Habermas could have used this argument 10 years or 15 years ago, then even those people have changed their mind, hopefully partly because of arguments I made. There is no reason, neither on normative grounds nor empirical grounds, to say that religion is and needs to be a private affair. That they realize that you cannot discriminate against religious citizens. And this, of course, the notion, once religion becomes a republican religion, a democratic religion, because the argument is, in Europe you have ecclesiastical institutions with great power. American religions were simply republican groups of civil society. So therefore you cannot discriminate against some citizens because they are religious. And once, if you wish, the Catholic Church, of course, once the Catholic Church itself accepts the freedom of conscience, and that each individual has the right to use her conscience also in the public sphere, then there is no argument to exclude Catholics from the public sphere. So it is a combination of rethinking. First, because empirically we've seen it. Religion has come back to the public sphere, has become a public issue, even in countries where you don't see religious revival. There is no much revival of religion in Western Europe, but you cannot get, religion is always now a very contested issue in the public sphere. But now the next question is, how and which kind of religion? And then it's not a question of the state, because even if there is a secular state. Again, there are 2 models of secular state. One that precisely begins with a theory of religion. Religion is bad, therefore has to be controlled, has to be kept in its place, the argument of laicity. The other argument is the one of the American state that says, no, we both, no religion is privileged by us to be closer to us, to the state, but also we give total free exercise of religion for everybody. So the function then of the secular state is perhaps to protect the quality of all its citizens, particularly minorities. Because again, as Tocqueville saw, the real threat is not religion, is a threat not because it is religion, but because the tyranny of the majority. This is the majority that wants to impose its way upon others. But this is no different from any tyranny of the majority that basically Tocqueville argued. So it's not, the important thing is it's not in religion itself. There's nothing in religion that makes it. But of course, religion then, those vices or these problems that we have in democracy, in the public sphere, when you add aspects of religion, they made it more complicated. And we can get into the issue of how to revitalize, which role religion can have in the public sphere, a positive rather than negative role.
And in this meaning, the secularization for religion is the negative process as usually present, or whether this might create new opportunities for religion.
I mean, very briefly, and I let Sean also answer. You know, the great American German sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, who had been the great theories of secularization, and that was convinced that precisely religion was going to decline. And then he went the other way around and he thought of the desecularization of the world. And then finally he corrected himself and said, not really, the issue is not secularization, the issue is really pluralism. And two types of pluralism. Secular religious, the recognition that in the public sphere, in the modern world, you are going to have both religious people and secular people. So the question is how to get them together, to talk to one another, to work together, and religious pluralism. As opposed to the European model of a homogeneous one single religion, the fact that modernity produces religious pluralism. Not in Europe. In Western Europe did not produce religious pluralism because nowhere in the history of modern development in the West you have growth of religious pluralism. But immigration has brought religious pluralism. So the question is how to then, in the public sphere, religious people and secular people learn to talk to one another and to work together for the common good. As already Augustine in the City of God talked precisely of the secular age as this age between now and the parousia, in which both pagans and Christians have to live together in the city and work together for the common good. So this is the issue how secular and religious people can get together and how different religious people from different religions can get together. So the real issue then is not religion, but pluralism, religious and secular pluralism, and religious pluralism, and how this plurality of many religions and both secular and religious worldviews can live together in a democracy, in a liberal system.
It's fascinating that one of the techniques with the growing Muslim population in the United States. On the far right now, you hear a very interesting argument that says Islam is not a religion. Mm-hmm. So you're trying to define it out of the protections of pluralism. It's a security threat. It's a political movement. It is not a religion. And now I don't think that's going to gain much traction.
Fortunately, it was started by the Vatican. This argument.
Well, it may
to
have
put it not in the religious, but in the dicastery of culture. But
well, no, if we might at some point talk about the 1960 presidential election to see the arguments that Protestants made about Catholicism. But it is interesting to see that this is one argument for trying to justify marginalizing and regulating, even not letting Muslims come to our country because they don't enjoy the benefits of freedom of religion because they're not really religion. They're masquerading as such. Now, the fact that argument gets any hearing at all in the United States today is terrifying. I don't think it's ever going to become a majority position. But I want to pick up on one of the things you said. The struggle then, I think, comes from small minority religions. How do they claim the legal rights that come to them in the name of freedom of religion? And you see Jews went on a similar path, Catholics went on a similar path, Muslims. Now the argument is, are Muslims going to follow a similar sort of a path towards mainstreaming or assimilation or integration, whatever term you pick? That's going to be very interesting to watch. And among Muslim intellectuals today, you get different theories in America about, well, what is our path to enjoying the full range of religious freedom rights? I think it's too early to tell where that's going because we're in a period of backlash from the current political administration, but also simply people on the street. I think that's the big test today for American pluralism, is how are we going to allow and empower, and how are Muslims going to claim the constitutional power that is there for the claiming, and what does that look like pragmatically over the next 3 or 4 decades? I think this is the great struggle for religious freedom in America today. We have many advocates, Christian advocates for religious freedom, but who are very, very troubled by the presence of Muslims in our country. So there's a real tension in the minds of some of the more conservative Christian folk in particular in the U.S. that they have benefited from American religious freedom, but they're sometimes quite hesitant to share that right to minority communities, particularly Muslims. When I was in the Obama administration, we had hundreds of Muslims working at senior levels in the government. This was the first time in American history. Many of those Muslims have left the government now in this administration because they've experienced overt hostility. They have experienced covert hostility. So this is a real challenge for American civil society today in the public sphere. How do we navigate this as a country? And I think if there is an overlap with say, the Jewish experience, the ethnic Catholic experience, it's going to be trouble. It's going to be a difficult path. It's not a straight line. And that's, I think, one of the great challenges for American public sphere today is how do we allow religious minority voices the same kind of prominence in public sphere that my ancestors had, and it's an open question, I think, now how that's going to play out in our society.
And I may add, the real problem today is not anymore access to the public sphere, but the problem of the public sphere today, and we are talking of the digital age, is cacophony of voices. And the difficulties of creating a real conversation, a real dialogue in the public sphere. Both its political polarization, but not only political, civil polarization, moral polarization. And so the real issue today is not access or not access, but how to talk to one another and how to work together in the public sphere. And this, the secular people are not better or worse than the religious.
Yeah.
This is not a particular problem of religious people today or secular. This is a problem of our liberal democracies today in general.
That's right.
So, and obviously I don't say that it is, I wouldn't blame the digital age for it, but the digital age obviously has made it even more drastic. The other issue is that while we have come to accept as a principle religious pluralism, very few people today argue that there should be only one religion. True, the others are false. Very few people today argue this publicly. The real problem today is moral pluralism. Our real divisions are over morality, not over religion. I've always argued that if you go through the way in which religion was disestablished, or Protestant religion was disestablished in America, it went through 3 disestablishments. The first one was the establishment of the state church, so that you have denominationalism, all religions are equal, so religious pluralism is the result of the first disestablishment. Very little secular ideologies, competition, the public sphere of civil society was dominated by religious discourse. Through the 19th century, evangelical Protestantism was hegemonic until at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, you have the modern secular university, secular media, Hollywood, that break what was the monopoly of religious discourse. And so you have now the plurality of religious and secular discourses, but still very much within Protestant morality, the Protestant ethic. It was the 60s, the gender revolution, the revolution of moral pluralism, that really we are still struggling. We thought that societies cannot live with religious pluralism. This was why you needed a Leviathan, a confessional state, to impose a religion. We've learned that there is no problem, that people can live within a democracy with competing religions. The question is, can we have a real working democracy when we are so polarized over moral issues? And this is the task, and this is the test we have our modern societies, how to deal with these different conceptions of what the good moral life is.
And I think you'll find too that if you look at the larger religious communities, even some of the smaller religious communities in the United States, they are morally plural internally.
Exactly.
So this pluralism of ethics or morals is not, denominational lines don't wall them off from that dynamic. To give you an example, I doubt any of you are following this, but my denomination, the United Methodist Church, has just finished 3 days last weekend in St. Louis trying to sort the question of, can you have gay clergy, can clergy perform gay weddings? And everybody thought the denomination was going to embrace this. And guess what? The conservatives won. And now, having spent millions of dollars on trying to sort this ecclesiastically, the second largest Protestant denomination in America is on the cusp of exploding because they could not come to even a rough consensus, a broad, thin consensus on this issue. The main avenue was one of local choice.
It happened with the Anglican Communion first, right? Between the Anglican Communion, England accepted it, but the rest of the Anglican Communion in Africa and other places.
And the Presbyterians sorted it successfully, and now, but the largest mainline Protestant denomination is on the verge of collapse now because it simply couldn't come up with a way to hold the diversity of moral views on that particular set of issues. And we may see the largest mainline Protestant denomination explode before our eyes here in a matter of weeks. So it's denominational identification does not inoculate you against this kind of internal, deep fight over a host of moral issues.
You mentioned religious pluralism, and I cannot waste an opportunity not to ask you the next question. I know your point that Ukrainian religious context and also American, so they have a lot of in common. However, it's a bit different with Poland and Russia, where the Russian Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church established as the one dominant church. In that sense, how do you think the establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, maybe it will be, whether is it dangerous or not, that this church can be proclaimed or can be, let's say, declared as the national church, because it is supported by the president?
Well, I mean, there are similarities, of course, great similarities between Ukrainian condition in the United States. It's the only country in Europe that has developed a kind of a denominational model of religious pluralism, precisely because it has multiple churches of the same denomination. Mm-hmm. The same way that you have 3 Protestant churches, one the Congregational Church in New England, the Presbyterian Church in the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Anglican Church in the South, and none of the 3 could become the Church of the United States. Here you also have the Greek Catholic Church in the West, basically the Kiev Patriarchate in the center, that you could not make any of those churches the national church. Now, the difference, of course, main difference is there the hegemony was Protestantism, plural Protestantism. Here the hegemony is Orthodoxy, and even the ones which are not Orthodox Greek Catholics are also Byzantine in rite. So there is a commonality of Orthodox Byzantine culture, and even you could say Ukrainian Baptists and Pentecostals have some aspect of it. The reverence for icons, the reverence for icons is there. The reverence for icons is there, even among, so they're not iconoclasts. So, but then the question is, obviously, the worst thing for Ukraine is if Ukraine follows the Russian model and distinguishes between religions. And this was very bad when the parliament and the president tell the Ukrainian Orthodox that want to be loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate, you should call yourself Russian Orthodox, not Ukrainian Orthodox. No, they are Ukrainian Orthodox and they want to call themselves Russian Orthodox. This is the principle of denominationalism. Each religion gives itself a name and is recognized by others by this name. This is fundamental. Not the state gives names to religions or imposes how to register themselves. And of course, the implication is the mother of Russia, where you distinguish between our national religion, the Moscow Patriarchate, the historical religions that we tolerate, but with rights because of the historical reason of the empire, and then the new religions that we don't tolerate, we force them to register as agents of foreign powers. Mm-hmm. So this is what that hopefully, thanks to the fact that the Greek Catholics are there, and they are the most nationalists of any group in Ukraine, and therefore you cannot call them that the nation is Orthodox, because you cannot tell that Greek Catholics are not Ukrainian. And also because you already have significant numbers of non-Byzantine Christians, Pentecostal, but also because you have community of Jews and Muslims. And this is what was there in Maidan. In Maidan, you have all these religious groups, religious communities being united around a kind of Ukrainian civil religion. Again, the same thing. There is a civil religion which is none of the religions, the communities, but all religious communities accept this common civil religion. And I think that in this respect there is also a model there. And for me, the really important thing is that the Moscow Patriarchate, the last surveys we have is that 15%, almost 15% of Ukrainians claim still affiliation with the Moscow Patriarchate. I assume this is the core group. It will remain probably between 10 and 12%. And of course, the task of the Ukrainian nation is to welcome them as Ukrainians with a different religious identity. Not identity because theologically are the same. Of course, here the geopolitical aspect. Insofar as the Moscow Patriarchate is linked to the imperial Russian state, and therefore the relations and claims monopoly over this territory, canonical monopoly over Ukraine, then of course this cannot be accepted. And this is what Thomas basically did. Made possible for the other Orthodox churches in Ukraine to claim they are also canonical Orthodox churches. Not the churches have canonical monopoly, but the people have the right of religious freedom and to practice their own religions. So let's hope that the Ukrainian state does not really force a process of nationalization of one Orthodox church. That actually it is not going to happen, or it can happen only with a lot of conflicts and the end of democracy. Really, the end of democracy.
No, I think that's very important insight. I think if there's an analogy, it's not really analogous, but I want to talk about it in a moment, when the Protestant hegemony in the United States was threatened in the 20th century, and that was in the late 1950s, when John Kennedy, the Catholic senator, was talking about running for president. And there was an astonishing reaction among liberal Protestants as well as conservative Protestants. And what united them was the horrible prospect. In fact, there was a tract, American evangelicals, they don't write systematic theologies, they write tracts that are, 20 pages long and they're filled full of polemics. You don't need a systematic theology because 20 pages of Bible citations can solve any problem. And the title of it was, "What Happens When the Catholic Church Becomes 51% of America?" And so it was just this cascading list of horribles that when the Pope gets control of the White House, that we're going to lose our freedom as Protestants. They're going to name Catholicism as the state church, which Catholics always do, because the monarchy is what historically Catholics have always wanted. And so it was the political threat that the growth, you've got immigrant churches, it's post-World War II, the baby boom took place in the United States, so suddenly Catholic families are growing at a faster rate than Protestant families, and the Protestant fearmongers say, you just wait, it's only a matter of time till they outpopulate us, and then it all... So in the name of preserving Protestant religious freedom, they said you can't vote for a Catholic. And no sense of irony that your threat to my religious freedom means I'm going to take your religious freedom for you as a preventive measure. So part of this is a political power dynamic that comes from pluralism is threatening to some groups, I would argue. So if you've got a dominant religious tradition in a democratic polity, they're not, sometimes they have a paranoid view of the future. And if they see religious minorities gaining in population, they can do very undemocratic things, very anti-pluralistic things. And I agree with you, Jose, it would be tragic. And again, I'm an amateur with respect to Ukraine politics. I claim no competency. But when I came here in 2015, I saw the pluralism that you allude to, which was unparalleled in any other country I traveled to while I was at the State Department. And who knew? I learned that this was the case. And to me, it would be tragic if the alleged threat of religious pluralism here sparks a reaction by dominant groups to tamp that down, because there are public sphere, there are public moral, there are public political benefits to the pluralism. There are theological reasons for not wanting a state church in any context. And I would argue that the benefits of pluralism outweigh the threats, the alleged, the perceived threats or the real threats there. But I do think dominant religious groups in democratic public spheres are not immune to being seduced by future threats, slippery slope arguments that say, just you wait, the trouble is coming because there are going to be too many Muslims in a few years, and that kind of thing. So how do we theologically but also politically celebrate that the pluralistic path is a better thing than the state church path? Now, I realize in an Orthodox-shaped world, that discussion is different than in American polity, where it's been a Protestant hegemony that is evaporating. But I think the power dynamic there in the liberal democracy allows people then to flip from being pluralist to being populist, if you will. And that's what worries me about the global moment now, that the populist reaction says pluralism is a threat to you or a threat to me because it brings instability.
And of course we have here the great authority on religious pluralism, ecumenism in Ukraine, and I've been plagiarizing Marinovich for 20 years almost, saying that really the ecumenical task of Ukraine is not bring unity to the churches, but the three Romes to learn to live together in Ukraine. If they do that, if the three Romes learn to live together in Ukraine, then this is a great contribution to Christian ecumenism. So,
Amen. I guess now we have opportunity to ask questions.
Actually, Jose, you somehow, with your last phrase, anticipated, my question. What do you think needs to be done so that three Romes live peacefully, in Ukraine, and show what are the stumbling blocks, on this way you would like, to remove to make it happen, first of all?
Well, obviously the first thing is not to call each other bad names, right? Not to call each other schismatics, heretics. We have the true Christianity. Yours is a bad one. So this is the very minimal condition. They start calling each other bad names. The second one is a process of mutual recognition that maybe Christianity somehow has come in multiple forms and has always been like that unless it has been forced from above by the state to unification. And there is something about, theologically, to be said about there were four Gospels, not one. We know of all the churches of Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. We know, and it was only the emperor that tried to unify it. Of course, we aim for unity in the eschatological hope, but recognition of the other, of the rights of the other, to be the other, is of course the fundamental principle in any dialogue. So, and of course, I was so gratified when I saw the way in which the heads of the Metropolitan of Kiev, or Rus, is the way a patriarch of the Greco Catholic Church calls himself, and the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus of the new Church Epiphany, they were talking with one another, to one another, as friends, recognizing each other, their Christian leadership. And this was very, very, very illuminating of the possibility. it will be a while until this happens at the level. I mean, so if Orthodox stop seeing the unities as a threat, it's not unitism, it's not simply a different, another richness of the Christian tradition that emerges here. And if especially the two Orthodox churches, because now the real task is for the two Orthodox churches to recognize each other within Ukraine. This the other Orthodoxy, Greek Catholicism, thanks to people, has already been going on for a while. But it is the two Orthodox churches to recognize each other. It's not a question of canonical territorial rights, but simply of history has created these circumstances. We know it's linked to mother state formation with imperialism, and we have to understand all these processes. But also it's important also to go, not to respond to imperialism with nationalist exclusion. So the question is how to precisely come to terms with this with the past. We have to recognize the truth, we have to recognize and call the things as they are, but also look towards the future, towards reconciliation, towards simply the possibility of living together, both as citizens, civic friends, and as Christian brothers and sisters, right?
If I may only just to add one remark, so you might remember that Patriarch Shevchuk, he kind of proposed a very interesting formula or model. He started speaking about unity in action, not unity in institution. So in Ukraine it's jednanie, not jedność, but jednanie. Somehow, but
is the recognition of each other. We can work together first, and then there was somebody who would be please.
My question is about the differences between second and third Rome, basically, because it seems that it's not only the conflict about who has the territorial power on the Ukrainian, within the Ukrainian borders, whether it shall be Russian Patriarchate or Constantinople Patriarchate. Now it seems like we have some shift within the Orthodoxy as such, that especially this council which ecumenical patriarch called in Kritos, and which was not basically attended by the Russian and some other Orthodox churches. Do you think we can say that there are some processes within Orthodoxy that one part is kind of more open to the dialogue and to ecumenism and movements towards the West, and another one is more on this old path of the Third Rome and nationalism, etc. Do you think the Second Rome can be more open now to the uniats and to the West than it was earlier?
Yes. Well,
I mean the Constantinople.
You've been visiting Bartholomew. You've been basically visiting all of them.
What I don't want to lose is the theological dimension.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that what disturbs me is if this question gets reduced to the geopolitical, and I'm not accusing anybody of doing that, but to me the heart of the Christian gospel is not how do I love my neighbor and my friend, but how do I love the person who says I'm his enemy. I mean that, and it's such a tragic part of Christian history that we lose it. You know, the gospel calls us to love God with all our being, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to love our enemy. And we don't have that Trinitarian love formulation in our theology. Many times it's I will love God, I will love my neighbor, but don't get me started on that guy. Right? And to me, what Jose is saying, there's a theological response here that all of the parties have to, I think, hold themselves to this question. What does love of God, love of neighbor, and love of enemy demand of me and my church? It would be so easy to walk away from that third question. So if you label the other guy as your enemy, you're in trouble already. But we tend to develop amnesia as Christians, no matter which denomination you're a part of. But precisely, to me, that is the heart of the gospel. If you love God, that's easy. You love your neighbor, that's easy to do. It's how do I love the person who hates me? And we let ourselves off the hook on that question so often. So to me, the question is, how do you institutionally, given say the three different Orthodox parties, what does love of enemy demand of each of those parties? Now, I have no pragmatic formula. I don't know what that means, but I think we flee the question too quickly. We let ourselves off the hook. Well, they deserve to be kicked to the curb. They don't deserve our connectivity. They don't deserve our brotherhood and fellowship. And that's what troubles me here. And I see in the American experience, too often American denominations have quickly drawn a line in the sand and said, we're on the correct side, you're on the bad side, and we're not going to talk to you anymore. And that leads to, ironically, more division. The church, the sect I was born into, was started as a unity movement on the frontier of the western frontier of America in the early 19th century. It spurred three different denominations, ironically. It was there to unite all the denominations. It ended up creating more because the other were the enemy. And so I think that's part of the ecclesiastical theological question. And now, if you're a Greek Catholic here, what does it mean to be not just an observer of these dynamics, but how do you model engaging with the varieties? I would want to add to the third Rome, what about Azusa? You know, you've got Pentecostals, and they don't make any claims to being a fourth Rome. They come from a crazy town in Southern California, so that you do have groups here, not for exactly. So you need to have even a more expansive view. The three Romes are complex enough, I get that. But what do you do with other religious groups here that go back to Jerusalem, or they go to Azusa, or
to Krem, or to Krem?
Exactly.
The Muslim Tatars, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think from a theological Christian perspective, for me, the question, it's a question, it's not an answer.
But if I may, because I think that it's a fair question. And obviously, we know that there has been a geopolitical fight over primacy within Orthodoxy. That Moscow wanted to take this primacy away from the ecumenical patriarch, and this was the plan of the ecumenical synod to a certain extent. But the war in Donetsk and Crimea made it very difficult for Russia to take this role. And then there was the attempt they did to precisely divide the Orthodox world with the Tomos, and asking the Orthodox churches, if you side with us against the Patriarch, we are declaring the ecumenical Patriarch schismatic. And the rest of the Orthodox churches said, no, we are in communion with both. We're in communion with you, Third Rome, and we're in communion with you, Second Rome. They are not fully yet in communion with the new church, but at least they have not said that they are not canonical anymore. So, but this is a beginning. The attempt of Moscow to precisely play this game has not gone well for them. Neither, certainly in Ukraine, has not been. They've lost a lot. And on the world of Orthodoxy, trying to play this very hard geopolitics and putting a lot of money into it also has not been very helpful.
But is it only the geopolitical game, in your opinion, or there is something deeper in this? Like this, the synod in Kritos in 2016, where the Russians didn't participate. It was like the theme of this Kritos synod was to discuss the church, the limits of the church, etc. It seems they do have really theological differences now.
Well, let's call them ecclesiological. Not theological, but ecclesiological. Right?
So if I can add, I was in Crete for the Pan-Orthodox Synod, and I met with the Patriarch Bartholomew after it was over. And the reason we were concerned, it's not that the United States government had a favorite in that conversation, but one of the things I worried about was if the Ecumenical Patriarch had declared the Tomos much earlier, what was the Putin government's response going to be? And predicting Putin's behavior for breakfast tomorrow is an outlandish thing, much less what would he do. And I was truly worried that I had contacts in the wider Orthodox world. People did not know the answer to that question. And so we certainly did not want to see another incursion or invasion of Ukraine is a negative response. But I asked him, and again, this may have reflected my undiplomatic impulses at the time. I said, basically, I tried to get him, tell me, when are you going to do this? And he smiled, sort of held up his hand like, in due time, in due time. But what he said was very interesting.
The scaton is coming.
That's right. I was trying to nudge it, but he answered theologically. He did not answer geopolitically. Now, again, I don't want to overinterpret that because sometimes words are cheap. He said, I want to do what's best, either in terms of granting the Tomos or its timing, in terms of the impact on the unity of the church. Mm-hmm. So he wasn't saying, I'm taking real estate, or I want power. And I believe him. You know, when a patriarch tells you that it's not best.
But he was man enough in Moscow that he was happy to take some real estate away from Moscow.
I grant the point. But the fact that he would say that his commitment to trying to preserve and grow unity would put a brake on any impulse to do so quickly. And I found that impressive. So I think there were theological dimensions to this.
Ecclesiological very strong. I mean, this notion of territorial, canonical territory is a fundamental ecclesiological principle which is irreconcilable with modern human rights, with modern principles of religious freedom and so on. Right. So ultimately, it has to do with the direction of orthodoxy, world orthodoxy itself. So,
yeah, it's some small comments exactly to this point. It's very good that you mentioned this theological perspective and this, I would say, Christian answer on geopolitical questions, because what we see now that is come back geopolitics, especially in Russian rhetoric. All these ideas about Russian space, about Orthodox civilization, it's something which the Russians try to give alternative ideology to contemporary time and to build on this basis a new empire. And my answer is, in the West we have crisis of liberal democracy. Which answer can be on this geopolitical rhetoric and this ideological using of religion?
Well, if I understand your question right, the way I would answer is I would rather, speaking in the American context, and I think I may believe this everywhere, but I'll own it up. I would rather be a country that struggles with the meaning of pluralism in all of its glory and all of its complexity, as opposed to living in a world where we have a populist crackdown on pluralism. The horrors that are attached to that are well documented in human history. The question of can liberal democracy truly embrace a growing complexity of religious pluralism, that's an experiment that we don't have an answer to. I think the populist option is well documented. There will be winners, there will be losers, and the losers' lives will not be good in any kind of future populist domination. So if forced to make a choice today, I will side with liberal democracy and pluralism and the struggle for making that into the best reality. I will steadfastly reject the populist option because I think that is incredibly dangerous. That's where millions of people die. And I want no part of that. So I can't tell you clinically 20 years, 30 years, 40, 100 years from now, what is the state of liberal democracy and religious pluralism, but that's where I'm willing to invest my passion and my time politically and theologically, because that's an experiment that I think has possibilities for progress. The populist option, which I think is the only other option right now, terrifies me.
And I mean, if I may add, obviously what it implies too is the role of Russia precisely in the crisis of liberal democracy throughout the European Union, right? Because it is the link of the Ruski Mir concept, which is a notion of the Russian space, which was meant simply as part of the Russian Empire and part of the Moscow Patriarchate, right? To add the political theology of being the defenders of Christian tradition against the liberal secular West, which then leads to the way in which they've been, somehow, there have been responses, positive responses to their attack on the European Union on the part of both. Moral conservatives that like this idea of the defense of moral conservatism in name of Christianity, and what you call the old leftists that were against capitalism, against transnationalism, and so you have all leftist populism, which still was pro-Soviet, a new conservative populism, which is pro-Moscow Patriarchate, and this is a combination. And of course the combination is basically threatening what has been the great achievement of Europe, putting an end to 300 years of Westphalian wars of nation against nation, trying to overcome it, and then comes then Putin and says no, what the Helsinki Agreement was, accepting that we cannot change borders by force, it was broken, and Europe had no response to it. And the attempt on the part of Russia to bring back balance of power politics into Europe, to undermine the notion of European Union, and to once again create in which countries have to choose each other against each other. And this, of course, what we wanted to avoid, right? And this is, of course, the argument that then if you add the political theology of moral conservatism, then, of course, it's a very, very dangerous situation.
I would like to continue our reflections on this third Rome in Ukraine and in general, how to deal with Moscow. It seems to me that there is high time now to reconsider our notion of dialogue. Because so far, instead of dialogue as a search for values, search for truth, we have a dialogue as a means for diplomacy. And the Havana Declaration is a clear result of that second model. Because I may guess there is no everything being truth in that Havana Declaration. But it was signed. Why? Because in order to preserve the dialogue with Moscow, in order to have these diplomatic contacts, okay, let's turn the blind eye to what the Russians put down into this Havana Declaration. So now we have the situation when the Vatican and some Protestant in Europe suggest that we have to preserve the dialogue with Moscow at any cost. But it means at the cost of values. So in order to change the situation, but because this means that that we all play the Russian game. And I saw that at many ecumenical meetings. All churches come to be in dialogue as equals, hearing and listening to each other. The Moscow delegation arrives to fulfill what is said in the social doctrine of the church. We use the dialogue with the ecumenical movement in order to present our position. So it looks like that. The Russian delegation comes, has a floor, speak about its position. We are sorry, now we withdraw because we have many obligations, and go away. That's the dialogue.
Well, I had a slight different reading. It's true that the notion of ecumenical dialogue was searching for truth. But this was part of the old notion that there can only be one truth, that the truth has rights, error has no rights. And we've moved to a position in which persons have rights and the right to search the truth. What means that the dialogue then is not a dialogue between ideas, which idea is right and which idea is wrong, which truth is right, which truth is wrong, which dogma is, but mutual recognition of each other, of our dignity, and of the right and duty of our conscience to search for truth. If you have this new conception of dialogue, which is the conception which appears in Dignitatis Humanae and Nostra Aetate, which are the two texts that change the notion that only truth has rights and error has no rights, then of course what Pope Francis called the culture of encounter is not dialogue for maintaining diplomacy. Of course, if then he signs text that he himself doesn't take seriously, because these are not important, these texts. The important thing is that we met. Then, of course, this is a problem. So the question is, how do you bring the culture of encounter, which is based on this notion of a dialogue of persons, mutual recognition, not theological ideas, but then be wise and not sign documents which somehow precisely already impose one particular view. So I think that the impulse of Francis, I'll go anywhere to meet with, at anywhere, at any place, is positive. Then the notion, it's only a text, who cares? The important thing was to meet. This is the second part is not good. So again, this is the question of right.
I would add too, we were, in the State Department, there was quite a bit of consternation about the Havana Declaration. And I immediately started calling scholars that you and I both know and other interpreters of the Vatican. There is a more charitable interpretation. I'm not saying it's right, but there is a more charitable interpretation here. That, and whether in Francis's mind he achieved this, and we're not even sure that he. One rationale for signing what he did was thinking about protecting the faithful here. In other words, he knew there was great political pressure at that point. It was not clear where Putin was going to be going in terms of Russia's relationship with Ukraine. And I think one of the primary animating factors in maybe all Vatican diplomacy, but certainly in Francis's diplomacy, is protecting the faithful where they are a minority. Okay. So if you read it through that lens, you know, sometimes diplomats come together and they sign the same treaty and they go home with 180-degree different interpretations of what they just signed back in Havana. And I think this may be a case of that, where in no way did Francis feel like he was capitulating to Russia in all of its sphere of influence, but I think he was saying, as a stopgap measure, this buys more time in Ukraine for my flock here. Now, is a low church and middle church Protestant, I do not see that, but I was educated by a former mentor of mine that's the way a lot of Catholic bishops in the United States interpreted the Havana Declaration, that this was not some affirmation of the primacy of Moscow as the second Rome, but in fact it was an affirmation of, we have bought some political time to take pressure off of Catholics living in Ukraine. Now again, I offer that as a possible interpretation going forward. I don't think Francis wanted to precipitate more grief for anyone in Ukraine, but especially Catholics in Ukraine. Now, you may. I'm not sure I believe that interpretation, but that is one that certainly was given to me.
At least as we know that the response of him to the Ukrainian bishops accusing him of having done that was, of course, let's get every parish, Catholic parish in Europe to have one Sunday for Donetsk and for the victims and for the wars. So again, that is a complex question.
But I have only one objection. I don't think that naming Greek Catholic community in Ukraine not as a church but as ecclesiastical community is the way to support the local community.
I have no standing to say you're wrong.
Of course, this was
But I also think too, that was early in his diplomatic career. Right? When was
I mean,
Levan?
the context, it was 2 years ago. The context was also the
No,
negotiation.
longer than that. I was in the State Department when Levan was.
So it was 3 years ago then?
At least.
3 years, when was La Habana? When was Havana, which year? 16.
Yeah.
16,
Yeah,
3
okay.
years.
3 years in.
The context was also the negotiations with China, which are more complex. This is not part of the Ostpolitik. He doesn't want to be. The issue there is not really the Ostpolitik, communist regime, but more a state in for 2,000 years has always controlled the religion within it, has never accepted authority from abroad. So when people said Francis capitulated on China, you could say, well, the Chinese state capitulated. The principle that no foreign power can have any influence, because this was the argument about the Chinese rights, and even when the Pope said with the Jesuits no, was the fact he would not accept that the Jesuits were under the authority of the Pope at the time. And the Jesuits said, well, of course we want to maintain the right, the Chinese rights and Matteo Ricci, but of course we are loyal to the Pope. So the very acceptance on the part of the Chinese state of that this is a Catholic church to a certain incommunion with Rome, this was a tremendous already concession. And so in this way, it cannot be understood as simply this diplomacy for its own sake and Ostpolitik. I mean, in the case of Francis, I would have to say he is a Franciscan Jesuit. And so he's both cunning and very much. And so
from students.
Are there
Questions?
Yuri?
Okay, I'd like to ask you a question about recent initiatives from the side of Patriarch of Ukraine Greek Catholic Church addressed to Epiphany that a kind of dialogue should be started in order to find the ways of getting closer. Can we not expect, in your opinion, that Ukraine can become like a model, like a laboratorium of looking for the process which would get closer Rome and Constantinople? And Ukraine is a laboratorium of all of this.
Well, this was Sheptesky's dream, right? This was Sheptesky's
Yes, that's a dream.
This was the mission. This was the evangelical mission of the Ukrainian Catholic Church.
What you think about this perspective, whether it is feasible, not feasible, because our initiative is one thing, and we can do something together between Ukrainian Greek Catholics and Ukrainian Orthodox, but it is like a vision of how to get closer Rome and Second Rome, and they are not under our control, unfortunately.
I mean, here, if I may very quickly, obviously, First Rome and Second Rome have gone a long way towards that. They've been doing it. Already several popes have done it. It's not only Francis, it's already several popes have done it. And obviously, Ukrainian Orthodox relations to the Greek Catholics has also changed dramatically. It's not, I grew up, I didn't grow up, but my wife grew up in the Ukrainian diaspora, where even then Catholics and Orthodox didn't have good relations with one another in the diaspora. This, of course, is totally not understandable today and unthinkable. So again, I think that in this respect, we think Ukraine itself, the relations between Orthodox and Greek Catholics has changed dramatically. And of course, there is much to go. And as I said, especially if they don't call each other names and so on. So.
May I ask a second, maybe like an objection to what you mentioned with Francis, what he did with China and his recent visit to Arab Emirates. On the one hand, we can see this as a fundamental breakthrough. But on the other hand, is it not a kind of legitimation of those regimes in those countries that uses Pope Francis just to legitimize what they did?
It's all of the above. I mean, I think there were mutual benefits between the Emiratis and the Vatican, and I think they both went home, well, actually, the Emiratis were home, having achieved something for themselves. But this is, I want to defend diplomacy. That kind of diplomacy is not always a bad thing. When diplomacy is bad, when I go home getting everything I want and I've taken it out of your skin, okay? That's not diplomacy, that's domination. Good diplomacy provides plausible explanations on both sides of the table. Now, the Emiratis are not morally pure actors. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, I don't want to drill down into it. But again, there are 1 million Catholics in the UAE.
How many?
There are 10 million people in the country. 1 million I think only 3 million are native to the Emirates. It's an immigrant or migrant majority country. There are 1 million, and they're from Philippines and they're from India.
Philippines and India.
I think what was driving that diplomacy was trying to shore up the tolerance for Catholics. There's not religious freedom there, but there's a form of tolerance. I think it was it was pastoral.
And of course a model then for other Muslim countries.
Yes.
We do not recognize the right of Catholics to be there.
Yes. And so I think in his view, it's going to be almost impossible for the Emiratis to crack down on Catholics going forward after signing that document on human fraternity. So he bought something, he won something at the negotiating table that is, I think from his view, theologically, pastorally, ecclesiologically, very, very good for 1 million faithful. Okay, that's not something to sneer at. But the Emiratis can say, of all the countries he could come to and sign a document, he came to speak to us. So in the sort of Gulf country competition for who's the most influential country, they shoot near the top now in the world's eyes because they are where the Pope decided to come, not to Saudi, not to Turkey, not to the other options there. So
And we must understand that La Habana for Pope also has a signification. It's the place where the part of the also peace process in Colombia, where he had been active, the role he had played in the diplomatic relations, or at least the rapprochement between the U.S. and Cuba under the. So there was a symbolic thing to choosing La Habana as the place. For the Russians, it was a recognition. This used to be our own colony, so we were back home. For the Pope as well, this is Latin America. This is where we have also played a role in working between Cuba and the United States, and also for the countries within Latin America. So there are always many, and I always tell my Ukrainian friends, understand. This is from the perspective, for the Ukrainian perspective, may look very bad. And yes, it's a much larger picture. And so we have to try to see the whole picture and so how these aspects,
And this Havana meeting was also good for Kirill. It was just before the Pan-Orthodox gathering where Moscow participated, and he could claim to not only with you the Pope meets, but also with me.
But also the reason they met in Havana too was Kirill was on a South American trip consecrating 6, I think it was, new cathedrals. Where he has no flock or people there, but they have built with Putin money large churches. And he just, I happen to be in the neighborhood, Francis. You're going to be near there too. So why don't we stop in Havana and talk? Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was brilliant.
One question.
I have
The last
question.
one.
Just, how do I put it? So I'm going to ask about the kind of the distinction that was drawn by Jose earlier about between moral versus the moral versus religious pluralism, and trying to situate Ukraine within that. Because in the American experience, the religions tried to coalesce with one another, but that ultimately became less an ecumenical project and more a moralistic project, that our dialogue became very much about ethics. How do you see Ukraine fitting into that? Because in Ukraine, very much there's a pretty well-shared common ethical culture, there's kind of a secularization now coming in from the West. How should Ukraine kind of navigate those tensions between religious dialogue vis-a-vis moral dialogue? Should religious dialogue devolve to merely ethical dialogue, or how do they maintain a conversation between ethics and religion?
I mean, this is a tough question in the sense that it's almost the question only begins now becoming a practical question, and how it's going to develop, we don't know. I've always claimed, in the context of orthodoxy, the Ukrainian orthodoxy has had the advantage of being really a frontier orthodoxy, was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, had to confront the Catholic Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and it tried to have its own Reformation. And there is an element in which part of this culture, we know that with the incorporation of, I mean, this was the project of Mohyla, or the Mohyla Academy, of the Kiev Academy. We know that with the absorption of Ukraine to the Russia, much of this tradition was basically suppressed, and even it helped Prokopovich went to Petersburg and actually brought the tradition of the state controlling the church, because it was the model he had seen in Amsterdam, right? And so this is what the Protestants do. And they are very modern, so let the Orthodox also do what the Protestants do. Let the state also eliminate the party. So, but even then, precisely because this pluralism, and even it's not a question of polarization between East and West. I don't think that Ukrainians per se, many of them wanted to have the Russians as enemies. It is a Russian action towards Ukraine that creates this condition. And so it is, there is a more opening to the West, which is both, it brings these debates, which are in the best more actual, but also it creates the possibility, because of the common traditions, to deal with them. So I don't know, I hope that and the Greek Catholic Church probably here has a particular role to play, of one in which, without focusing only on moral confessionalism, that those are the things that define us as Catholics. But those are important aspects of also morality, but then to go beyond it to issues of social justice, to issues of peacemaking, to issues of the gospel. Blessed be the poor, blessed be the peacemakers, blessed be the, so.
I really want to add to that, and again, acknowledging my rank amateur status. My fear is that the trope of traditional values can colonize the Ukrainian conversation. And I think that's what's happening with Russian influence in the United States now. We're seeing, and we have a mutual academic friend, Christina Steckel, who's studying this, that the rhetoric of traditional values has just, really in recent years, been injected into Russian diplomacy around the world, and that's because it tickles the ears of fundamentalist Protestant Christians in the United States. Mm-hmm. So that's a move towards the moral, which is not really a discussion, it's an attempt to polarize and to dominate. So to me, that's the one diabolical option that Ukraine may be vulnerable to. Now, how vulnerable, I'm in no position to assess, but I would think that would be very dangerous.
Yeah. Distinguishing that ethics versus value distinction to an extent, and clarifying those tensions.
What I think what Russia is doing, they're saying, the West is against traditional values. Stay with us against the secular, liberal, demonic state, and we will protect traditional values. You will not lose your soul here. And that's the extent of the conversation. And now attached to that is the list of alleged abominations that are undermining traditional values. That's a political agenda. That's not really a robust theological or moral discussion, but it's codes for different things.
And actually, I will have to add, from my own perspective as a Catholic, that it was Pope Francis that avoided what otherwise would have been precisely this coalition of conservatives, Catholics, evangelicals, and Orthodox around this issue, also on the geopolitical level, in Europe particularly. I mean, I still remember I was with Marinovich in Gniezno, where was the dialogue of religions, and there was a panel in which already Archbishop Hilarion already made this proposal of an alliance with the Catholic Church against liberal atheists, and mentioned it to the Protestant, the head of the Protestant, German Protestant church. So there was a project that the Russians have proposed to the Catholic Church to unite. It was the Holy Alliance against revolution, against this thing. And of course, because of the commitment of the Catholic Church both to social justice, to human rights, to religious freedom, then obviously they're coming at a full Holy Alliance on these issues, and therefore it's a much more robust.
This instrument was used when Ukraine had to sign an agreement of association in 2013. There was a huge number of people coming from Russia to Ukraine just using the same argument not to sign this agreement of association.
Right, exactly.
Volodymyr asked to be on time at the next location, so thank you for this amazing, open, really